Hello, everybody. We're excited that you could join us today for our second live webinar in our CI/CD series. Today, we're going to review a real-world use case that our team helped to develop. It enables software developers and network teams to reduce the time for deploying new applications by integrating the application CI/CD pipeline with the network change processes. Before we dive in, my name is Morgan Stern. I'm the VP of Automation Strategy at Itential, and I'm joined today by two people who have been instrumental in working with our customers to integrate CI/CD principles into their network automation and orchestration initiatives. Karan Munalingal, who is our Head of Solutions Engineering, and Ankit Bansali, who is a Senior Solutions Architect. They'll be joining us later, or Ankit will be joining us later for the demo portion. Karan, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Morgan, thanks for having me. We're super excited to collaborate with you and Ankit today to kind of talk about one of the scenarios that we hinted on in our last webinar around how CI/CD plays a part in both the app dev world as well as NetOps and the CloudOps world. So looking forward to it. Thank you, Morgan, for having me.
Yep, thanks, Karan. During today's webinar, we're going to be having an open discussion around this use case. We're going to be planning subsequent sessions to talk about other use cases as well. Like last time, please feel free to ask questions along the way, and we'll answer them as best we can. So let's go ahead and get started. Just to recap the session that we had previously, really what we wanted to focus on was talking about the way that pipelines and network automation and orchestration capabilities are a good complement to each other. So if you remember what we talked about last time, we really focused on the fact that pipelines are great for providing consistency and repeatability for managing things like versioning, testing coordination, merging, validation, and approvals. But when you start to apply pipelines to activities that have a heavy networking component, it really makes sense to leverage network automation and network automation tools in areas such as creating and generating payloads, around creating test and executing testing of the payload changes, and then for deploying the payloads into the network. Because these are the areas where things like order of operations and engineering and business logic become really critical. And we think that network automation tools are more suitable for providing those kinds of activities. To talk about a specific example where this has been implemented, I'm going to hand things over to Karan.
Thank you, Morgan. For the brief recap on how network automation and the pipelines actually complement each other, providing a collaborative approach to DevOps, NetOps, and CloudOps team, so they can actually, provide the best product and service possible to their end consumers, right? And we talked a lot about, several scenarios last time around in our last webinar around how CI/CD means something different to different personas across various teams, right? It could be your product engineering team, it could be your NetOps team, it could be a CloudOps team. In today's presentation, we will focus on the use case where an application developer that is focused on creating a robust and appealing application for their customers are leveraging Git pipelines, right? It's a very common thing today to attain their CI/CD goals. However, most applications these days are data-driven and require access to some critical pieces of infrastructure and data that might not be in the same infrastructure, right? It could be in the cloud, it could be on-prem, etc., right? Which means, a GUI-driven application that has been created still needs connectivity and access to the data and these assets to actually drive things like analytics dashboards and something that's productive for their end customers. So how does someone who's writing code, a software developer, actually get access to these resources that might be on-prem or somewhere in a secure space in the cloud? Granted that they can't make some of these modifications to the network, right? So in the current model today, what we have observed working with a lot of our customers as well as other experts in the community is they have to swivel chair, right? So if you're a software developer, once you're done with your pipeline, you are now swivel chairing to an ITSM system to actually create not only one, but multiple tickets at a time to actually garner changes within the security profiles, changes in your network assets, so you can build that circuit end to end, starting from your application all the way to the data source that might live, way out of band in on-prem, within your campus. So granted that team members from different silos, right, whether it's a security team, the networking team, the cloud team, have to provide and stitch these things together, it usually on average takes 5 to 10 days for a software developer to actually get access to their data, right? And how does that impact them, right? In order for them to actually roll out robust application and high velocity, they're not able to do that if it's taking half a sprint just to get access to their data, right? And that's not an option in today's world, because they have to roll out applications that are robust and useful at a very high pace and high velocity into production. So how do we eliminate the bottleneck that most organizations experience during fulfillment of some of these network services being offered? All right, and the solution is an integrated pipeline, right? An integrated pipeline is how we can address the challenges our app dev community run into to achieve some of the most robust CI/CD pipelines that span beyond just the application layer, but into network resources that are critical in order to make sure that they're able to provide a well-tested application out in production. So let's discuss how an integrated pipeline would work. As you can see on the screen here, it's a combination of an existing pipeline that a developer has created and is using as part of their application level test and deployment strategy, plus in combination with automations being created by the NetOps and the CloudOps community, right? Teams within the organization that are very network focused within their own domain are also creating their own pipelines using network automation tool. And one of the points that I would like to highlight here, Morgan, that you hit on early on is right tool for the right job within the right domain, right? It's great that an application developer is leveraging a Git pipeline for their own piece at the application level, but empowering your NetOps and DevOps communities to create the same level of rigor within their own domains becomes very important, because it's a combination of both that's going to get you, the best application possible that's high quality, right? So as we look further at this integrated approach here, in sort of swivel chairing over to an ITSM system and creating multiple tickets for infrastructure and network services, the developer can now instead include steps within their existing pipeline to request for infrastructure and network resources that will be delivered in an automated fashion, resulting in faster access to critical resources needed for their robust end-to-end application testing, which essentially empowers them to deliver more features faster and with better quality. All right, so as part of this webinar today, we're also going to do a demonstration to show you how an integrated pipeline would work, right? So what you're looking at right now is basically an experience that a software developer would have, or instead of, as I mentioned, swivel chairing to another technology, they could continue using their existing pipelines and invoke automation that have been exposed by your NetOps and DevOps and CloudOps team, where the automation that are focused across multiple domains leverage things like sources of truth, such as Infoblocks or Netbox, integrate into your existing DevOps strategy like Ansible, Terraform, and your pipelines, in addition to making network changes across a vast variety of domains here. So for this specific example, granted that we're actually providing network connectivity for an application that requires data stored in a secure space on campus, we are going to be focused on modifying SD-WAN policies using Viptela, right? And then we're going to be modifying ACLs and security policies in the data centers, while also creating interfaces within the campus in order to tie all that end-to-end. So now your application developer is able to do testing against real data that is stored in the right space, right? So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand things off to Ankit Bansali, who's our senior solution architect, and he's going to be walking us through what this would look like within the Itential automation platform. Ankit?
Thank you, Karan. Thank you, Morgan, for those amazing overviews. Appreciate it. I'll quickly talk about this now. So I've been talking to our customers and prospects, and they have challenges which you have outlined, right? When building an end-to-end automation, basically from software development to software deployment. Since Itential does do multi-domain orchestration, integration, and automation, I would like to present to you guys a scenario which came up recently and will help expose few of the requirements and challenges when trying to achieve end-to-end automation. So I was working with a developer where a feature was being built to support sales analytics on a sales dashboard application. The sales dashboard application goes back into the corporate network to access data. So as part of the deployment of this application, the developer was following software best practices and had a standard CI/CD pipeline. So let's take a look at the pipeline the developer provided. Quickly sharing my screen. Give me a second here. Guys, can you see my screen? Cool. As you can see, I'll click on the old GitLab CI/CD image. It does linting, unit, and security tests, which are only application level or code level tests, which the developer has built in. But to accomplish an end-to-end goal, the developer will also require assistance from the cloud team to instantiate an infrastructure where the dashboard app will be deployed, followed by the request into the networking and security team to attain access to the data that lives in a secure on-prem server for a complete end-to-end application testing and production rollout. So these were the challenges that we uncovered that I would like to highlight based on the conversation. The developer was super proficient with the CI/CD process, but did not have the necessary network services to consume. By necessary network services, I mean deploying the infrastructure as a service, networking to connect to the on-prem network as a service, security firewall changes to access the data as a service. So all of these pieces were missing. So I asked the developer, how do you currently approach this kind of a problem statement? So she replied back saying that right now they log into these ITSM tools, they create tickets for the cloud infra team, for the networking team, for the security team, and wait until all of these requests has been resolved. Sometimes this request might take from few days to few weeks. So they do have to wait even though their code development was complete. So the only way I suggested to make progress and in this scenario to be more efficient, it was if the developer could include readily available services from those teams and could enhance their existing CI/CD pipeline to do an end-to-end automation without the wait. So we built a solution that solves these challenges and makes the CI/CD pipelines more effective. Let's take a look at the pipeline. So I'm sharing the pipeline which we built together. So this is enabling the cloud and networking and security team to expose services from Itential automation platform in their organization, and the developers can consume these services via APIs, which will accelerate the software deployment cycle. Looking at the pipeline, there are 4 stages involved here. What I did was I compiled all the application level, code level tests into application test section. Anything related to provisioning infrastructure goes into an infrastructure stage. Anything related to deploying an application on the infrastructure that was created goes into an application deploy stage. Anything related to the application connectivity goes into the application connectivity service request state. Let me show you how this service looks like in the Itential automation platform. So we're going to explore on how the application connectivity service looks like in Itential platform. So that service which you just saw in the pipeline is being exposed as an API from Itential automation platform. And you can see I've associated an API webhook called as GitLab pipeline. the automation that's associated to that service request is called as Application Connectivity Service V2. So this is an automation that will provide the connectivity to access the data from an on-prem secure network. Considering the multi-domain orchestration and multiple sources of truth challenge, the steps in the automation will help resolve those issues. Looking at the automation from left to right, just after the start, you see there's a network connectivity pre-check. This is a very important step, and it does pre-validation on resource allocation. Then following up with these additional steps, which would be reservation of interface using netbox, IP reservation using infoblocks, core router interface configuration using a NetMiko script, an ACL update using an Ansible playbook. And the last two steps are super important too, which is the SD-WAN policy activation using the Itential's SD-WAN with Tela integration. And at the end, sending out a Teams notification to close the loop. So these were the steps we built in this automation flow. Now let's get to the demo, and I'll present the solution to you guys. So this is a sales dashboard, and you can see it does not have any access to the customer data. So now I would like to expose the route to connect to an on-prem secure server and access the data. The way I would do that is by enabling a flag in my code base. So let's do the next step where we will try to enable the flag. Let me bring up my code editor. So what I'm going to do right now is enable the prod DB flag to true. I'm going to hit save. Let me bring in my terminal. And if we see git status, let's take a status. Okay, we can do a git diff to see what changed. That's perfect. We can then do git add the file. We can do a git commit with the message connecting to prod DB. So before I push or trigger the pipeline, what I'm expecting is once the code is pushed into the pipeline, it should, once the code is pushed into the repository, it should trigger a pipeline, and the pipeline should trigger all the necessary services to achieve an end-to-end automation, allowing the sales dashboard application to access the data. So let me push the code. And I'm using the main branch here to push the code that will trigger the pipeline. But eventually you can have a merge request that can also trigger a pipeline. So once I hit enter, it should push the code change into Git. Let me move these aside. And now if you look at this dashboard repository, and let me hit refresh. And there you go. Looking at the pipeline, it already started. So if you see the pipeline will do the standard application code level test. Under the application test, it's going to do the infrastructure piece that's required for the application. It's going to do the deploy piece. That's where the application will be deployed. And then it's going to call a service in Itential that's going to make sure there is connectivity to the on-prem data. So we will wait for the pipeline to complete. At the same time, let's take a look at the service coming into Itential. So if I hit refresh here, you see there was a service request that came into Itential. And let's take a look at the service that's running right now. Looking at the service request, it's already provisioned the service, and it's following the path here. if you look at the service request coming in, it did the pre-check. It made sure it got the reservation done on the netbox side on the interface. It made sure it was able to get the next available IP from Infoblox. It did the code router interface update configuration. It added a data center access list via an Ansible playbook. And then we did the policy activation that helps bring the on-prem data. And at the end, we called out the MS Teams notification to close out the loop. And looks like this is already complete. So looking at the Teams notification, we get all the steps we took in that automation as a final audit trail, where we have everything that was done, gathering information from Netbox, Infoblox, configuring ACLs in the data center, and then provisioning an SD-WAN policy, which is the SC regional application policy that will allow access on the sales dashboard. So let's take a look at the dashboard. So if I go to the dashboard and hit refresh, and bingo, we have access to our database, which was on a secure on-prem network. So the conclusion part here is, as we can see, I was able to connect to an on-prem secure database and access the data successfully. So now the application developer has an end-to-end application testing capabilities. And in addition, it does not have to wait to get access to the data sources. This highlights Itential's capabilities of handling automation and orchestration across multiple domains. That concludes the demo portion. Back to you, team.
Thank you, Ankit. That was a really good demonstration. I think the point to bring up here, and I know I'm going to invite Morgan here too. Morgan, I think it's critical to kind of highlight the fact that as more and more organization try to roll out applications, right, and that are data driven, that rely on not only infrastructure but information that could be distributed across a network, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. Empowering our NetOps and CloudOps team to actually create some of these automations, and the example that Ankit was showing in the background around how we were able to integrate into, the way that they make changes today, as well as API-driven technologies, right? So the combination of NetOps team being able to leverage an automation platform like Itential to create some of those flows and expose that to machine-driven pipelines, where an application developer, whether it's one change every day or 15 changes in an hour, granted that the way that some of these automations are built, we can effectively check and make sure that there are not duplicate circuits being created, right? So one of the points that Ankit also highlighted as part of the automation being built by a network automation team member is to actually make sure if the application already has access, right? So this is where it becomes very critical for NetOps, DevOps, and CloudOps team to insert their tribal knowledge into automations. And you could consider this their own way of, attaining CI/CD, right? It's one thing to perform unit tests against your application. It's another to actually do an, system integration level testing against your network, because there's so much happening behind the scenes where you have to interface and interact with your sources of truth, but also network devices, whether they're virtual or hardware, or some assets within the cloud or in the SD-WAN space, right? So I think this was a really good example of how pipelines that folks are geared towards using today for their application development is very complementary, right, to an automation platform. I think it's a combination of both that empowers our organizations to roll out more features for their end customers. Morgan, any addition that you would like to make?
Yes, for sure. Just to answer one of the questions that came in. Yeah, the session is being recorded. It'll be available after pretty much all the webinars that we do are recorded. So Ankit, thank you for the demo. That was great. I do have some questions, and if you can go back to your screen share stuff, there are a couple of things that I wanted to
Sure.
give you an opportunity to elaborate on and to kind of dig into some pieces. So, this has come up now, I know, with a couple of our customers and then with other folks that we talk to, which is kind of, how do I deal with this challenge of making the application developers, giving them the ability to move and deploy at the speed of their coding capability, as opposed to being constrained by internal processes. So in a lot of environments, though, the folks who are the application developers are like in a different group than the folks who are providing the network services, right? If I was on the network side and I had the automation system, what would be the pieces that I could expose then to the application developers, so that they could use these network services? Like, what are the components? I know you showed them real briefly.
Right.
I just want to make sure for the audience we kind of show them what are the components that the networking team could then develop and share with their internal software folks.
Yeah, no, great question. Happy to elaborate here. So Itential gives you that ability to expose services as an API request. And by that, I mean, you can have different teams build these small use cases as a service, and you can let the application developer put these kind of services in their pipeline so they can go at a much faster rate and have these kind of guardrails around it where they have ability to access the data they need, and they don't have to wait for a whole lot of time to get that access. This is an example I took for our use case where application connectivity V2 as a service, which is basically an automation that's being calling into multiple sources of record to do the best in terms of following the best practices of the organization, right? So we have to be really thoughtful in the business process of that organization. So by letting different teams the ability to build their own solution and helping the other teams to consume those services, it just streamlines the whole end-to-end concept and makes it a reality, because Itential lets you do that when it's talking to multiple sources of truth. So again,
sorry. So
no.
if you go back to the previous screen, and just to kind of reinforce this. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with the platform, what Ankit is showing is a feature within the platform called the Operations Manager. And so the things that are showing up in that left-hand column, those are the services that he's talking about exposing. This is completely configurable by the user of the platform to be able to have control over what kinds of services you would want to then basically expose and advertise to those internal software developer customers. So there's a whole lot of functionality that's built into this. Under the covers, obviously, you've got things like access controls and security and whatnot. But I think the power of this is now you've got the ability to create a set of building blocks and functionalities that can be consumed not only by your network team, but by any other authorized users in the environment, including the software development team. So you go from an environment where maybe some folks have the ability to do scripting. Now you can expose this to any of your internal users who are authorized in a way so that they can consume them, build them into their pipelines, and really get a greater sense of velocity.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. Thank you, Morgan. And just to reiterate the concept, right? We are calling different types of sources of truth using different frameworks too, which is a benefit because we expect developers, NetOps, engineers to have their own solution. So what they could do is bring their own solution into Itential and then work with different sources of truth and have build a service which they can share with their developer community so that they can, start developing in a better environment.
So you've mentioned some of the integrations. I just want to make sure that we sort of enumerate them just to clarify for everybody, because we've referenced a few different pieces. So on the screen here, I see Netbox, I see Infoblox, we talked about the Vitella piece, we've talked about the MS Teams piece. And I think This, to me, is a good example of an area where there's a pretty significant advantage to be gained by leveraging some of the automation capability, like within the context of the pipeline, in that for the integration or the automation platform to provide access to this functionality, it's a relatively simple process, right? Somebody can install an adapter, and if there isn't already an adapter on the open source site, they can generate one very quickly by just importing the API spec. There's no software development required. Once you've got that, now the automation system has access to all of those connected systems, and providing that functionality within the context of a workflow or a service that you would expose is really very simple, right? What you see here on the left, we're getting interfaces from Netbox, so we're getting some inventory information. We're getting available IP addresses, and then we're leveraging things like NetMiko to start to create the interfaces, and then later we're interacting with Viptela to actually do the policy activation for the security piece. Are there any other points you would want to point out, Ankit?
No, you have outlined them amazingly. All I'm saying is how easy it is to expose a service having Itential platform, and then again doing multi-domain orchestration, because all of that just accelerates the automation and let somebody build an end-to-end flow. And again, we are very much sacred on the business processes organizations have. So we never try to, we always try to follow the guidelines of what the business process is for that organization, and they are free to, make it their own.
Hey, Morgan.
Cool. Yeah.
I would like to chime in on one point, right? This absolutely ties back to how, the platform is complementary to, get pipelines and the right tool for the right job, right? It's reducing the burden on software developers to actually embed this level of network intelligence within their pipelines and allow the pipelines to be what they are, to facilitate the application level unit test and integration tests, et cetera, right? But when it comes to talking to multiple domains where different teams are involved, Itential helps our customers create some of these as a service, as we mentioned early on. But not only that, when we're talking about integrating across a wider set of technologies in the ecosystem, data manipulation has always been a challenge for the developer community, not only from an application level perspective, but also folks who are creating automations for the network, right? And that's why I think eliminating that and providing a low-code solution so they can, in tandem at the high velocity, provide these sort of capabilities, just like a software developer is providing that to their end consumers with respect to features and functionalities, right? So how do we kind of bring that together where, hey, I want to roll out a new dashboard that requires access in the network. What kind of services can I include in my pipeline instead of having to think about how can I build that into the pipeline, right? It always ties back to what you had mentioned in our first slide is how can we take a collaborative approach between pipelines and an automation platform to solve the problems that organizations are having across delivering some of these applications at a high rate with really good quality.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that this is a good example of is something that's been, to me, gaining a lot of momentum and is one of the really exciting things about the maturation of these like technologies and the related technologies, which is a lot of times when folks are talking about things like network automation, they're really focusing on the perspective of the network engineer. Like the engineer has the thing they've got to do, they use automation, they get it done, they write a script or they create a workflow or whatever. And I think what this is a really good demonstration of is where things are going, and the folks who are getting the best benefits from automation and orchestration are the ones that are doing things like this, where they're saying, hey, it's one thing to make an engineer more efficient, but it really becomes transformative to the organization when the engineers can take these assets and make them very consumable by other folks within the other organization or within the organization in a way that the engineer doesn't even necessarily have to be involved, right? they can create these automations. They can expose them through the facilities that Ankit was showing. And this can be something that can be utilized 24/7 by the internal audience, right? So the person who's the primary actor in this is the application developer, right? They're just leveraging what the network engineering team has made available to them. And so the network engineering team is adding value without having to be like real time involved in the transaction, which I think is super exciting and really, like I said, exemplifies what I think is the future of automation and orchestration, which it isn't about the engineer having to do a thing real time. It's about the engineer taking what they know and what they can do and making it consumable any point in time at any scale that's necessary by the organization. So I think we're kind of getting near the end of the session, and I wanted, before we kind of go any further, thank everybody for participating. But before we close things out, Ankit or Karan, do you have any closing thoughts or ideas that you wanted to communicate to the group?
Morgan, I think one of the closing thoughts that I would have is, as discussed in the very first webinar around CI/CD in this series, you mentioned, right, the impact of NetOps and DevOps teams actually contributing towards reusable automations that are consumable by different entities, whether it's a machine, whether it's a human, etc. And I know in our upcoming series, we talked about a specific scenario here where the end consumer is a software developer, but in the upcoming series, we're also going to talk about how similar automations could also be consumed as part of a service that someone actually orders from Portal, right? Or it could be an ITSM system that, you know, someone fills out the 3 pieces of information, and you know, the networking team and the security team can build their assets within flows like this to orchestrate and provide that as a self-service asset, right? So I think the one piece, again, to kind of focus on is think about this as a cohesive solution that complements your existing technology choices as well as operational choices, right? In a software developer's case, the way that they operate is through their CI/CD pipelines, right? That's the best way to do it with their software principles. That's great. But then you have in other cases where things could be triggered based on an event that is happening way outside in the network or in your infrastructure. So how do we also facilitate some of those ways to consume what the networking and the cloud team are building using these sort of technologies that we presented today? But that was the last piece that I had more.
And thank you for those comments, and kind of thank you for reiterating the intent of this series is to because it was way more than we could cover in one session. So now we have the opportunity to kind of use sessions like this one and the following ones to kind of deep dive into different examples, because we're seeing a lot of different use cases, a lot of different communities being able to benefit from this. So as Karan mentioned, in upcoming sessions, we'll look at different scenarios where the stakeholders may be different groups and kind of cool different use cases. So certainly keep an eye out for future invitations. Ankit, thank you really very much for presenting this. Do you have any closing comments before we wrap things up?
No, thank you, Morgan and Karan, for the opportunity, and I was happy to communicate all the thoughts we had from our customer and present it into a solution here. So thank you for having me.
Karan and Ankit, thank you guys for participating in this, and thank you to everybody who is viewing the session, either live or recorded. We appreciate any feedback or questions that you have, and we're looking forward to seeing you on the next sessions in the series. So thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.